Hello and welcome back for the Art Camp 3 Week 12 critique. So this will be our final critique of our finished final paintings. More of the same stuff we did from the last couple weeks, looking at our finished pieces and how to push them that last little bit further to make them really good, high quality portfolio pieces to show off, maybe get jobs, maybe sell prints, get famous and rich and popular and all that. We'll just dive in here and start doing some paintovers. I'll do my best to watch the chat and make sure that that's working. If you have any questions about any stuff, go ahead and let me know, because otherwise I will just start churning through some critiques. All right, let me make sure the chat's working before I dive in here. Yeah, that seems to be good. All right, so this is really nice. I really like this. It's really nicely done. It's good, solid composition. It's nicely rendered. It's nice and crisp. It's got a great variety of colors to it. Um, yeah, overall, it's really nice. You're doing some great stuff that's a little bit more subtle with the values, doing this kind of tight value range stuff like you're doing back in here, where, within the context of the whole piece, it's obviously all darks and midtones, but you've got nice interchange of values within those tighter value ranges. So that's really nice to see. Um, there's a little bit of wonkiness with the perspective in a few areas where I don't have quite as strong of a sense of the ground planes. So, for instance, here and here, they're sort of painted in such a way that it feels like the same perspective. Like if you took this section and moved it down here, it would feel like it's in place, which obviously isn't quite right, because if you've set your horizon line as right about here, which it seems to be, maybe it's a little higher. Um, Regardless, this is going to be above your horizon line. And it gets a little confusing when you've got something like this, because this will start to imply that it's sort of flat. The way you've painted it just kind of implies that it's flat ground. But to have it up here that looks the same, it means that the ground is actually a little bit tilted towards us. Um, so that can be a little bit confusing and something to watch out for. So there's some little areas like that, and then just a few areas where I think you could exaggerate the perspective a bit. Like you've done a good job with the roundness here of these things, but I'd like to see maybe some stuff breaking the silhouette and making it more obvious, where there is a little bit that going on, um, just to make it clear that you're really looking up at this stuff and you're missing out on some of the bases of these forms. Um, I think you could perhaps go a little bit darker with some of your values. That could be an issue with the monitor and the way it's calibrated and stuff. But I feel like you've got a bit more value range that I think you could work with. Um, the other thing is I'd like to see maybe a little bit more kind of secondary payoffs here. Because right now you've got this nice focal point going on here with this really nice lighting and really nice values going on. But I kind of wish there was a bit more of a second payoff, whether that comes from illuminating some other areas or perhaps making even this top area a little bit more interesting, showing off a little bit more of this landscape here. You could even make this little area fairly interesting in its own right if you take a little bit of extra time and throw some stuff in there to really catch your eyes. You could put some mountains like really far away. Uh, just something of a second focal point. Because right now the initial read works quite well, but there's not much to look at beyond that. So just a little something to think about in regards to this. Overall, I really like your colors. There's a ton of variety in here. There's lots of nice teals and oranges and purples and reds, and it's really nice. It's really nicely balanced out and works quite well. for what you're going for. Um, yeah, looks really nice. I don't have too much to say, and overall, your rendering is really nice. It could use with obviously a few areas that are a little bit less finished. Um, or sorry, it has a few areas that are a bit less finished that could perhaps use to get pushed, particularly as you get closer and closer to the edge of the canvas. It seems you get a little bit more lax, and it is important to kind of go right off the edge with your rendering ability, and making sure that it's kind of rendered edge to edge to varying degrees. Um, I think that's about all I have to say on it, though. It looks really nice. I really, really, really like what you've done here. As far as storytelling goes, there's one other thing you might consider, and thinking of how these rocks are up here and how perhaps you could have one or two that have clearly fallen down. Might be kind of cool to see. They're a little bit fresher and newer. Same goes for maybe working on this transition and making it more interesting. Perhaps having a little bit of greenery here, some shrubs and stuff growing in there. It kind of depends on what sort of story you want to tell. Do you want to say that this is a really old kind of opening, or do you want to say it's a really new one? Because you can have it old by having lots of growth and trees and stumps and shrubs and stuff around this that have grown in, or you could have a very new opening where suddenly this has been opened because of a cave in and you've got lots of new fresh debris down here that doesn't have the liquid forms that we see in caves like this that have slowly and slowly developed. Rather, some new developments in there. So, just a few random thoughts there um, regarding storytelling, but overall, really nicely done. I really like what you've done with this. Right. It's really sweet. Love the colors. The color work here is really fantastic. I think that's working phenomenally well. Um, let's see here. I think this is kind of another case where I'd like to see another another payoff. Obviously, this critique being in mind that it's not quite finished, it's not quite rendered to the point of finish yet. But with that said, I would like to see some more payoff because you've got this, one tree here, which is a pretty good payoff. It's not quite epic enough to be that important for us. I'm not sold that it's the most important thing in the scene because these trees here are kind of just as important color wise. So there's not too much to differentiate this one besides the size of it, which can be fine. And of course, the figure is always going to be a focal point. But I might like to see a third focal point. I find that if you've got three areas to catch your eye, that's typically enough for a really nice landscape and lets people look at something for a long time. So obviously, I'll just throw a mountain back there just because it's something. But that could be anything. It could be another tree back here that is also really bright and colorful and provide something else for us to look at. Um, I also like to see something more done with the foreground spaces. Right now, this area here is not really that interesting, and same goes for here. And it's okay to have some quieter areas of a painting, but it'd be nice to have something going on there and not just fading off into nothingness. You can do that partially with um, partially with the lighting and the color and stuff. That could perhaps be enough to make it interesting, but be sure to do that. Um, yeah, but really nice lighting, really nice colors. Uh, quite fond of quite fond of what you're doing here, and a nice solid composition. Nice little S shape here for this um, river, so always works well. So yeah, really really solid start. Yeah, just a quick question in the chat. On Art Camp 3, will it be able to be purchased non-live like the other art camps? Yes, yes, it is. Um, all the art camps you can purchase when they're not being run live, which is after an hour or so from now, when this course wraps up. So Yeah, they're all going to be available forever. You can always purchase it, and you get to keep it forever. There's no subscriptions or anything like that because I don't like paying for things and then not having access to them forever. So I don't like doing that to other people either. So yeah. So anyways, this piece is really nice. I'd love to see this taken to a really tight finish. This is a fantastic start. Right. This is cool. Um, Nice sense of perspective you're starting to get going here. I think it needs a little bit further, but I can definitely see what you're trying to do with it, and I think overall it's working pretty well. I think it's partially your mark making and the size of your details, and the way you're kind of painting the forms that is throwing off the perspective that I think you're trying to get in here. Because looking at it sort of abstractly, I can definitely see the perspective in there, and I think it's working pretty well. The problem is that you've sort of broken up your shapes into similar sizes, no matter where they are, which is sort of confusing things and uh, killing a little bit of the perspective that I think you were trying to get. So I'd say, first of all, be a little bit more comfortable with taking out the details in the distance. Realize that things are going to get faded out, and you can actually do with quite a lot less detail in the back. So that'll sort of solve some of your problems that you're facing here. Furthermore, I'd get a little bit more reference to really figure out how exactly these cliff faces will look. Getting a cliff face to look interesting is certainly a challenge. I know all about it, having painted many of them myself, that it can be hard to make something that's essentially a flat surface look interesting and have enough variation in it to make it seem like it has form and it has cracks and crevices and different layers going on and all that. So try your best to get some more reference for that, just because it is a really hard thing to make up on your own. And then I'd start to look at incorporating some of these reflections here and realize that for this water, odds are the closer it gets to you, the darker it's actually going to get, rather than vice versa, like you've got. As it gets further away from us, it's actually going to be reflecting more light. And then as it gets closer to us, we're going to see more into the kind of deep water. Obviously, as it gets closer to the shore, it's going to lighten. So it's this strange sort of case of it lightening as it gets near the shore, and then kind of darkening as it gets closer to us. It's just sort of some strange value stuff that happens with water and with large bodies of water. It can be a little bit tricky to eyeball, but it kind of comes with time. You start to think about these things kind of in layers, just like we think about each of the different fundamentals when we're trying to solve a painting problem. You can kind of do the same thing with water and trying to figure out the different things that are happening. Just figuring out the color of the water itself and what color it's going to be, how dark it's going to be, and then you can start to think about the reflection. And all right, the further away it gets from me, the more sharp that angle is, or I guess rather, the more shallow that angle is, the more reflection it's going to have of the sky above it. So that's actually going to lighten it back there. And then think about anything that's happening on the surface. So any waves or ripples or anything like that, and how is that going to affect the light and the colors and the texture of it? Think about anything underneath the water that might be showing it off. So thinking about these sandbars going into the water, they're actually going to end up lightening uh, the water a bit because you're actually going to be seeing some of that sand because it's not too deep right there. So water is absolute pain. It's cool when you get it right, but it is extremely difficult. So uh, a few things here. Trying to do what I can to push your sense of perspective. So by actually knocking out a lot of the details you had, already I think there's a bit better depth here. Even though I haven't really changed much of your values aside from your water, I think by knocking out those details and leaving the details where they should be, you're going to have a stronger sense of perspective here. All right. Just checking the chat and making sure it's working. Um, so yeah, I don't have too much else to say here. I think overall it's working quite well. I think it's an interesting composition. The values are holding together fairly well. I think this is one of the more successful things you've done here. I'd say overall, do be sure to get lots and lots of reference because I can sort of tell some areas where you're trying to make it up without having enough context to go on, and that can really, really complicate things and make it difficult for us. So, anytime we can find some reference that is even kind of sort of close to it to help us out there, help us out with how to render it, how to paint it, how the light's going to work on it, how a landscape tends to form. Those are going to tend to be the stronger parts of our painting for quite a long time. Um, but I think this is off to a good start. It's got some good focal points. It's fairly interesting. Um, yeah, there's certainly some good strengths in here. So yeah, looking good. So moving on. All right, you got some really nice colors and mood here. It's obviously not rendered how I'd like to have it rendered, but it is off to a good start. I think my issue with it right now is that I don't really buy the lighting right now. So you've got these really strong oranges from some intense lighting, but I don't really buy the lighting as it stands, and it's partially because the lighting is so isolated right now. I think part of the thing is that you haven't gone in enough to really imply um, all the bounce light that you're going to get off of this. So you're going to get a lot of light bouncing off these areas that are being hit by the direct light, and it's gonna actually reduce a lot of your contrast, which is, I believe, what you need to make this a little bit stronger. So by tightly rendering a little bit more, it allows us to have some amount of softness in here, which I think is what we need for these pools of light. Keep in mind that when you've got a pool of light in a landscape, it's going to tend to have a softer edge than something as small as a figure, because when it's on that size scale of a landscape, it's generally going to be dispersed by the atmosphere a lot more. These shadows are huge cast shadows. Um, to be able to have that, they've got to go through a lot of atmosphere, and thus tend to be a bit softer. And so that's where you get that nice pooling effect, where you've got sort of soft gradients happening on the edges of your forms. Um, so I'm all good with nice textural forms and lasso tool and sort of techniques like that. I think they're extremely valid. But there's something powerful about like going back in and incorporating that softness. It's it's a strong quality to have in a piece and can play nicely with some of the crisper, harder forms and edges that you've got in this piece. Of course, I'm always a fan of if you're going to have some pools of light in one area, go ahead and add some other ones. For inspiration on this, go ahead and look at Thomas Moran. It's just incredible painter and did such a beautiful job of just rhythmically adding in little pools of light all throughout his paintings. And of course, in my mind, he goes a little bit too far overboard. Um, and I kind of wish he'd tone it down a little bit sometimes. And his paintings end up a bit unfocused. But there's certainly some power in what he does, and some lessons to be learned and stolen from him. So if you've never had a chance to see one of his pieces in person, they're absolutely incredible. They just really glow and sort of are more effective than when you see them online. Because part of the problem with seeing them online is we're seeing them so small, whereas they enjoy the advantage of being really massive paintings, which he can get away with being a little bit more scattered with some of his light and composition because the simple scale of the painting, how it's supposed to be seen, lets that work more effectively. Yeah, I think this piece would benefit from a bit more softness and a bit more pools of light like that. And then another thing I'd like to mention is sort of half-assing your clouds back here. And this is just the most perfect opportunity to have some sweet clouds. And I'd hate to see you sort of slack off on those. So this is your chance to really shine and do some absolutely beautiful clouds. There's kind of no reason not to on a piece like this. So I would encourage you to. Um, You've just got such a good lighting setup and value setup and color setup that you may as well just go in here and really make these epic. And then make sure as you go to finish that you work on clarifying your silhouettes and making them really read and be strong. So if you've got white birds like this, keep in mind they're not going to actually be that white. They're going to be tinted by the color of your light source. So these are actually going to be a lot more yellow orange because they'll actually be catching the light of your light pools here. And so that'll actually bring your values back into alignment and will be another thing that will help this sort of pool of light here read better. Because by throwing in pure white things like that, you're sort of killing the sense of light here. You've got to keep all these things balanced out and within proportion to one another. And lastly, I'd say that you're still being a bit tentative with your foreground here. This still feels pretty far away, and yeah, it sort of gives it some more of that background effect. So I'd encourage you to be a bit more bold with having some stuff that is covering up the background here. Really include some huge foreground elements. Whatever those are, I don't know, but don't be afraid to overlap. Because right now you're sort of doing the effect of continual layers back that are never overlapping with what's behind them. So don't be afraid to go back in there and really get in some forms that are hiding a lot of the cool stuff you're doing in the back. So yeah, looking really nice. I think this is working fairly well, and yeah, I'd like to see this one taken to finish. Right, got some really good work this week. This is really nice. I really like the color palette. I'm assuming sort of inspired or taken from some old master paintings. It certainly has that look, uh, but that's a great thing. They are fantastic to steal from. Um, uh, I really like your background here. I have almost nothing to say about it, other than the fact that I think some of these trees could be a bit bluer to push them back there a little bit more. I think you could tint these just ever so slightly bluer rather than this kind of verdant green you've got. Aside from that, I really love it. I think your background here is extremely successful. I think your foreground is actually what is more holding this piece back. This tree, I just kind of want to get rid of because I don't think it works. It's the same value as this one. It's sort of on this kind of same plane because I can't quite tell what's happening down here, and it's kind of jammed down there in the corner. And I think I'm going to be a happier person kind of take it out. No offense to it, but I think you're going to be better off just taking that whole tree out. Uh, yeah, I think already that works better. Um, as much as I say you need foreground elements, you've got a lot of foreground elements here, and you're working well with what's over here, and this just was not working super well. So rather, you can kind of use this space to establish and work on a midground um, and make this area kind of interesting because I like what's happening here. And so start to show us this transition between this midground coming up to our foreground here. Really, really make that work. Next, this midground behind this foreground tree here isn't quite pushed back far enough. I think part of it is that you should probably be working on some different layers here because it feels distinctly like you're trying to paint around this tree, which is one of those causes that can make things flatten out a bit more than they should. So this is another case where I think things could go shifted back value-wise as well as color-wise. I think you could push them a little bit more blue, make it very obvious that this is going into the background. And is that sort of transition layer to the background. And then with this, I see what you're trying to do with this root here, but you sort of did it tentatively. So go ahead and really, really do it. Let this thing actually come at the camera. Figure out that roundness. And be bold with it. Really get that thing to come at us rather than just kind of swooping around in the corner a little bit. Really let it go. Let that perspective work for you. And I think you could benefit from a bit more saturation in some of your areas here in the foreground. This is kind of an area where you're allowed to. Yeah, I think some more blues in some of your shadow areas could benefit you because I think they're getting a little too dense and red, dense warm tones, which are okay, but can get a little too overwhelming, and it can feel just a little bit muddy in a sense. That's typically when we've got too much of a certain color temperature and the shadows aren't quite working as well as we'd like them to. So yeah, I think even just adding that little bit of blue back into these shadow areas started to add a bit more interest to this. Yeah. But overall, I really like it. The design and shape of these mountains is fantastic. They've got really nice forms to them and nice layering to them. Your clouds are working great. They've got really good form again, and a pretty good sense of perspective. Maybe push that last little bit down here. Let this really distant foreground ones really, really recede so we can get as much depth as we can out of the scene and really nail that scale. But really nice piece. I really like this one. It's just a few little tweaks here and there, and I think you'll have a really solid piece. Right, it's looking cool. Definitely off to a good start. Yeah, value-wise, it's working quite well right now. So I think most of my issues with it are going to come down to um, strengthening the perspective and strengthening the sense of lighting as well. So perspective-wise, the landscape, the mountains in the background are working pretty well. But the problem is the perspective is sort of flattening out here. I don't have a strong sense of what the perspective is doing here. And that's really important for something like this because you need to feel that this tree is extremely grounded. Furthermore, if we're looking up at this tree, which we are, based on the perspective here, we want to have that sense of grandeur here. And so we want to be playing up the perspective as much as possible. We want to use every little trick in our toolbox here to make sure that we're uh, we're emphasizing that sense of scale. And that gets really hard when you're dealing with all of these branches, um, but it's also absolutely essential. Um, the thing about the branches is I'm not really buying that they're ending right there. It feels sort of like you didn't quite finish the tree. Uh, I kind of want to see these branches keep going. They tree branches tend to taper to basically nothing, um, and so I'd like to see them continue to taper, continue to have some smaller offshoots. That's another thing that I think will help the scale here. Um, I know these are probably supposed to be fairly small fairies, but still, this is a fairly big tree, and we want to make sure that it reads that way. And right now, it's staying on the canvas. It was very boxed in by the top of this canvas and the sides, and it doesn't quite work as well. It doesn't quite get the scale. Whereas if you start to move it off the canvas, as well as letting these branches taper to their conclusion, you're going to have a better sense of these uh, scales here. Lighting wise, I think it's working pretty well, but it feels a little weaker than I think it should be. So if you're going to have lighting that's this intense, I feel like it shouldn't just stop. I feel like you should get a bit more happening as it goes down into these rocks and into your foreground. At the very least, you're going to get a bit of reflection going on directly below it, as any surfaces might be reflecting what's above them. Also, do be careful about too much softness. I think you're using a bit too much of a soft brush in places where I think you need actually a little bit more crisp painting, where you can use tight values, uh, but you need that stronger sense of painting to be able to imply the perspective that I think this piece needs. Because I want a good, strong sense of perspective here at the base of these roots. And I think there's just a bit too much of an airbrush feel to these things. Um, there's obviously nothing wrong with airbrush, but you got to be careful with doing that and overdoing it. Same goes for these rocks. I think there's a bit too much of a halo of bloom around them. I can see them a little bit crisper. And then a bit more of a fade off. I think that light sort of stops too abruptly. And the atmosphere here sort of affected by it a bit more. And perhaps even silhouetting this tree, you can play up and push this mountain behind it back a little bit. I also wonder about changing the color of the sky just to differentiate the color of this from the background. Um, you can either go one way and have this light source perhaps be a little bit bluer or something, or make the sky color something different, just to make sure that we realize that this is a different light than the light that's illuminating the sky. And we'll kind of mix up our color palette a little bit and add a little bit extra dimension to it and make it more interesting. Yeah, but overall looking good. Um, Certainly off to a good start. Uh, yeah. Uh, the other thing is be careful about your shadow areas where they're not being illuminated by this artificial light source. Don't neglect that, yes, they are still being illuminated by this sky, which is currently established as very green. And so you're probably going to want fairly greenish tones illuminating your shadow areas. Some areas you seem to have a fairly warm tone, And it would probably be good to imply something like that, either by darkening it and letting that be kind of moonlight, or something along those lines. Really think through those secondary light sources and even tertiary light sources, and make sure those are working well. So yeah, looks good. All right. Oh, really nice colors. Um, I think 2/3 of the painting is working really well, and then just don't know why this part exists. uh, Obviously, I am a big fan of foregrounds, but I don't know that this really counts as a foreground. It's not simple enough to be intentionally simple, nor rendered enough to have some interest in it. So it's one thing if it was pure, just one color, and you were just going super bold with your foreground here, and it's clear you didn't want to paint anything down there. It's sort of this weird middle ground where it's kind of sort of rendered, but there's nothing here. And there's not even anything to help imply the perspective. Because if you are going to do some crazy foreground, you're going to want to very subtly and with great difficulty give us a better sense of depth here. So you can do it in the same value range you've got, but you want to use these little dunes and stuff to kind of go back into the landscape and let them come towards the camera and make something interesting happen there. So, it's not particularly easy foreground to get to go this simple, but it does work. You just have to put in more effort than it seems. Those simple foregrounds are an absolute pain to do. But I think works a little bit better. And just like the other critique, I'd kind of like to see a bit more pools of light going on here. You're sort of starting to do it here, but very tentatively. It's working great on the edges of these forms here. I think that's quite successful. But these background ones, uh, you've got the opportunity to actually show off a lot of the form of these silhouettes in a very simple way. So just by having a bit of light that does sneak around the edge of these, that's a little stronger than what you've got, you can actually tell us a lot about um, forms while keeping relatively close to a silhouette. Um, by breaking that silhouette and allowing almost some rim light that isn't just on the rim, that's how we get some really strong senses of form, even when we're dealing with mostly silhouetted pieces like this. You've got to really think almost more about the form when you do have a silhouette like this, because you have less kind of opportunities to show us what's happening with that. Um, and then with those pools of light here, I think they could be a little bit stronger, less tentative. And then the stuff you're doing back here with that kind of rim lighting, be sure you're doing on these, even though it's obviously a different angle, so it's going to affect these forms differently. Be sure to use these silhouettes to your advantage to show off their form, to show off the lighting, get some nice overlap going on here. This is a case where you might have to be painting these rocks on a different layer to be able to effectively get these nice sweeping horizontal forms of the sand behind it. And then I think you could add some more areas of light in here without throwing off your color palette or your value structure. I think you can very subtly go in here and add just a few areas to kind of punch up the effect back here, where the light is, hitting it a little stronger, where there's a bit more uh, of a intense light. All my uh, all my little paint over on this piece is fairly subtle, but that's because it's a pretty subtle piece. Um, your colors are really nice, and I think your value structure is really nice as well. It's just these little tweaks that I think this piece needs to be incredibly successful. And then just to render it a lot stronger than you have, do a lot more rendering. And then when you do add in these stronger light pools, don't forget to add in a bit of reflected light on the stuff around it. Yeah, looking really good. Not much else to say to it other than keep going. Yeah, bring this one to finish. All right, this is looking really, really nice. Uh, yeah, this looks beautiful. Really nice colors. Really strong, strong fundamentals going on here. Um, Personally, I'd still like to see some areas that are a bit tighter, um, but that's me. I'd like to see, especially in your focal areas. This is good, but I don't feel like it's actually finished. It kind of depends on where you want to go with it and the level you want to take a piece. But frankly, if this was me and this was the level of detail I had, I'd want to take it the next step further and really get in here, at about this fidelity and show every little bit of this rock and really tightly paint it, give it nice crisp edges. Same goes for all this other stuff, where it's pretty close to being correct, but perhaps isn't quite as thought out as it could be. Not to say you have to. There are ways to, of course, be painterly with pieces, and I'm certainly not opposed to that. Um, it's just it is important to make sure that that always feels and is intentional. So some of these like pieces of moss, for instance, don't really feel intentionally rough. They feel just they were done quickly rough. So oftentimes to get an interesting brushstroke when you're dealing with digital, you've got to erase back into it and work things a bit more than you'll have to in oils. So do be wary of that and make sure you're being careful. The last thing is that I think the perspective got off a little bit at some point in the foreground, in that this foreground starts to feel like it's tilted down towards us a bit. And some of that might be because you're trying to get a river effect where it actually is flowing towards us, but it feels like even the ground is tilted towards us a bit more than it should be. So be extra careful with going back in here and, for instance, uh, extra clarifying where the ground is meeting the water. This is a case where being painterly and being a little bit too rough is making it so that your edges are becoming a bit muddied. Like I can't quite tell where the water ends and the tree begins here. That's a case where you've got to be extra careful. Um, just like I always talk about silhouettes, that's sort of an interior silhouette that is really important and will help to solidify your perspective here. Same goes for the silhouettes of these trees. I think that's a case where again you've got to be a bit tighter, even though you can be obviously painterly with a lot of stuff back here. You want to make sure that that silhouette doesn't feel like it's too just kind of haphazard and there's soft edges where there shouldn't be, because that's what you're doing when you do stuff that's a bit more painterly, is you often have edges that don't make as much sense. It's fine to obviously have soft edges, but you have to be careful about where they're placed and what they're implying, because soft edges will tend to imply that something's a bit um, softer, actually, that doesn't quite have that crisp edge. Whereas a tree trunk, is obviously going to have a rather crisp edge. So making sure that those edges are correct for the things you're trying to imply is very important. So, for instance, you could have a soft edge that's fairly rough and painterly on grass, but it's probably going to need to be looser than the ones you're going to use on a tree trunk if you're going to make sure to describe each of the materials that you're painting in the way that they should be. Um, yeah, just a little bit of thought there. It's something you can get away with a lot easier in oils than you can in digital, just because the nature of the medium. Digital tends to be less interesting when you do painterly marks, and actually requires a lot more work than people give it credit for. But obviously, really nice piece. Uh, it's probably like 90% of the way there. I'd say to push it that last little bit because I really do like this one. I think it looks very, very nice. The colors are gorgeous. The lighting's fantastic. Composition works really well. I really like this. I think this is a very strong piece for you. So very nicely done. We have a sweet dragon. It's really nice trees. Uh, obviously, I'm interested in the trees. Uh, yeah, this looks really nice. Um, so there's a few things that I think are initially confusing me about this, um, and I'll try to work through those and make it as clear as possible. The first thing is that I'm not quite convinced of the scale. I'm not sure how big this guy is in relation to this. Because based on kind of the spikiness and the tree trunks and stuff like that, am I going to say that this guy is yay big? Um, and if so, I don't feel enough of that. I don't feel enough that this guy is so tiny. Because right now, based on how I feel like he's yay big. And so I'm trying to first identify why that is. And the first thing I think that I see is that I'm not really getting a connection between this foreground and the background. Uh, this area of where you're describing the midground is way more important than people think, uh, because that midground kind of gives context to the background and the foreground and how they relate, how much distance there is between them, um, and the relative scale of everything involved. And we need to make sure that we're really clearly expressing that. And for instance, that could be by continuing to use these little spiky forms here as they go back and continuing that shape language as it enters uh, midground here. And even by just doing that, a little simple thing like that, suddenly it's like, okay, now we kind of know, because by working back there and having ever increasing smaller forms like that, we're getting a better idea of just how small or large something is in this scene. I think that's a tool to look out for and make sure you're utilizing. Make sure you're being clear enough with this midground um, to make that obvious. The other thing is this foreground element really isn't working for you. It's not doing enough. It's really nice on its own, but it would be nice without the actual focal point. Right now, it's kind of distracting from your focal point. So even though I think it's quite good, it's quite successful, I'm actually going to paint it out for a minute. And I think it's actually going to help the balance of this piece a fair bit. Because this piece is all about this dude, this dragon. This was sort of distracting in this corner. It wasn't adding to the scale. It was, in fact, hiding a lot of the scale. and not letting us enjoy quite as much of this stuff as I think we could. So instead, I think we're going to actually have some more mid-ground elements and let this be your foreground here. I think that works a bit better. You might disagree with me, and that's fine. You do not have to agree with all of my critiques. That's totally fine. I think that works a bit better and helps to focus our eye on the stuff that really matters. Um, I might actually tone down some of the contrast up here in areas that it doesn't matter as much. I don't care as much about some of this contrast up here in the forest because it doesn't really tell us a lot about what we're trying to look at here. Um, there's some anatomy weirdness with the dragon. Dragon head looks really nice, but I'm not exactly buying the rest of it. And this isn't obviously a creature design course, but there's something about the way this creature is overlapping with itself that isn't quite working for me. I'm not sure whether the neck needs to go one way or the other, but I think it all at the end of the day comes down to the fact that the silhouette right now, his head is merging with his neck, even though you're trying to have a quite long neck that is sort of doing this arcing motion. So watching out and making sure that that silhouette is really really fantastic. It's the same lesson you're using successfully on all your trees and even your foreground figure right now. That the silhouette alone reads, and it makes everything a lot easier in your painting process because that silhouette is so strong. Whereas your silhouette for this guy, it's sort of boxy for his body, and then his head and neck sort of merge into this one shape. And that just sets you up to have a really hard time expressing what's happening with him because your silhouette is not doing any favors for you. In fact, it's making it quite a lot harder for you. Furthermore, I'd say that his wings need to be a little bit bigger given the size of him. That's also kind of a nice thing because it lets us extend his wings behind this tree to the other side of it, which I think is kind of a cool thing. So just a thought there. Um, I'd like to see maybe some more pools of light here breaking through. I think having them just here and here isn't quite enough, uh, and I think you could use some more pools of light fairly effectively, and pick out other areas to push the perspective a bit, um, to accentuate some of this mid-ground stuff. I think that could be kind of nice to see. Um, yeah, not too much else to say beyond that. 'Cause I'm not going to get any more into painting that dragon or figuring out the anatomy or anything like that. I guess the last thing I would say is perspective wise on this tree, be careful that uh, the perspective up here is correct. Because obviously you're looking way up at it. So if you're going to look way up at it and this light source is coming from above, you're going to actually mostly see the underside of this tree, which is going to help this guy's scale as well. And I think keeping that in mind is really important. Um, and then along with that, then you start to realize, well, you're going to actually be looking up at a lot of him, which is part of why you're not going to see as much of his neck behind his head, because you're looking way up at him. So you're going to see mostly the underside of him, not as much of this top form. So make sure that perspective is really really strong. It affects everything you do, and is extremely important and very easy to get off on as you start to render. Because when you're zoomed in really really close to a piece, it can be harder to get that overall sense of perspective. But yeah, really nice, interesting color palette. I really like what you've done with that. I think all these greens and this orange highlight work quite nicely together. So yeah, and I think that's all of them for us. Yeah. So I think that wraps us up for this entire course. So thanks again, guys. You guys have been a fantastic class. You've done some really phenomenal work. I've been absolutely inspired by how much you guys have learned, how much you've improved. It's been really, really fantastic to see. Um, yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Hope you got a lot out of it. If you have any questions beyond this, just let me know. I'm not sure that I'll be repeating this course anytime soon. I've got some plans that I'll hopefully be announcing in the new year of doing a new art camp course for 2019. I'm not going to promise it yet because it's a pretty daunting one for me to do, but I'd certainly like to. And I'm planning as of probably around January, excuse me, around January, resuming my mentorship that I haven't done in many years. So it'll be a lot like the critiques you're seeing now, but way more personalized and way more in depth. We'll work together to produce some finished paintings and try to build out your portfolio even more. So if you're interested in that, I'll be hopefully launching that in January or February. So thanks again. I really appreciate it. You guys were fantastic and made my job really easy. And yeah, I can't wait to see what you guys do in the future. So thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.